It's all right. Watt is important. Watt is very important.
You're important.
Good. I don't know if that's good for me or...
Most standards.
As you may or may not be aware, once every semester, the UNC Center for Media Law and Policy provides a law speaker for our research colloquium. And this semester, it was an easy job to provide a law speaker because Wat Hopkins is here. He's a professor at Virginia Tech, and he's also our visiting Park professor this semester. So if you haven't been visiting with him in his office, he's up next to Don Shaw, and you should find him up there.
He has a turkey. There's a turkey.
He's a turkey?
No, he has a turkey.
Oh, he has a turkey.
Where I come from, we call that a hokey bird.
A hokey bird.
Turkey bird.
Instead of a turkey.
With gravy?
No.
Yeah, no. Runner. Good stuff. We have company. Watt is a native of Burlington. He earned his master's degree and his PhD right here. We think that perhaps he was our first media law PhD graduate, which would make him the original law dog. And so maybe we should get you a T-shirt for that. His advisor was Bill Chamberlain, who used to be here and then went on to Florida and has since retired. Some of you know who Bill is. So it's exciting to have him back. For all the years that I've been here, he's been a great friend to our faculty and to our graduate students, and been very encouraging to us always. Watt teaches communication law and journalism classes. He is the editor of an undergraduate media law textbook that we use in our undergraduate classes, and Dr. Walden and I are chapter editors in that book. He's also the very excellent editor of communication law and policy, and has been for quite a while. He's a former head of the Law and Policy Division at AAJMC, and he is a founding member of some Freedom of Information, of the Virginia Freedom of Information Advisory Council, and a member of the Board of Directors and past president of the Virginia Coalition for Open Government. He's written a lot of things, published a lot, including work about Justice Brennan and the actual malice defense and libel cases, topics that most people know about. He is when he's not cheering for the Hokies, he cheers for the Tar Heels, and it's really too bad he picked this semester to come here. Because he has gotten to the Dean Dome, but he hasn't seen anything pretty. So that's, I apologize to you, Watt, for the timing of this.
I think this is all coincidental. The fact that the Hokies are doing well after I left Blacksburg, and the Tar Heels are not doing well when I came here.
Let's just say
That's
we're not going to invite you back. Maybe a coincidence, but you're out of here. And are you going to say the word? That's what I want to know.
If I do, it will be a fleeting expletive.
A fleeting expletive.
It's spontaneous. If someone asks me a question that I can't answer, I'll say, oh, something.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It is a real pleasure to be here. I don't know what possessed Dean Folkers to invite me here for this semester, but it just came at a marvelous time in my professional development. It's given me the time to do some resting and do some recharging and writing things that I'm finding are fun. So I appreciate that, and I appreciate you being here to listen to part of this. Most of my research involves just some background, what I call line drawing. A great First Amendment scholar, Franklin Hyman, once wrote that, and this is one I didn't correct after I got in here, Franklin wrote that when it comes to regulating expression, the question isn't whether lines shall be drawn, but the question is always where those lines shall be drawn. And so what I do is draw lines, or attempt to draw lines, or attempt to figure out where lines are being drawn and where they should be drawn. And as we know, there are wide parameters. And this picture here, of course, is of Hugo Black. And Hugo Black once wrote, "I take no law to be no law." He purported to not believe in drawing lines. But then again, by the way, that's not Hugo Black, that's Oscar Wilde, who once said, and gave us a good reason to draw lines. Assassination is the severest form of censorship. When I teach my classes and we come to prior restraint, I teach my students, first I ask someone to define for me the word assassination, and someone always says murder. And I said, that's not the definition of assassination. An assassination is a political murder. Therefore, an assassination is a form of expressive conduct. You're murdering someone because of what the person espouses. But I don't think anyone would argue that assassination should be protected by the First Amendment. So somewhere between Hugo Black and Oscar Wilde, you have to draw lines or figure out where the lines are being drawn. So that's what I'm doing in this paper. I'm trying to figure out where the court started drawing lines with regard to offensive speech on the airwaves, and by the way, offensive speech elsewhere. Now, this paper has been accepted at the Southeast Colloquium, and before I found out about that, I wrote a colleague and said, you know, the paper's not that good. I'm not sure it's going to be accepted. He wrote back saying, don't worry, anything that discusses the F word is bound to be accepted. And it was. And so I'm going to be presenting this at the colloquium. This is an intriguing topic, the FCC versus Fox television stations case, because the case involves administrative law. The question that was asked the court was one of administrative law, and administrative law, for the most part, isn't very interesting. What made this case intriguing, however, is the focus on the language and how language overshadowed both the majority opinion by Justice Scalia and the key dissenting opinion by Justice Stevens. And as I've researched this, you know, this is going all kinds of places. The submission I sent to the Southeast Colloquium was only 23 pages long. This is turning into an article, and so far it's 59 pages long, and I still have 2 sections left to write. So this is very much a work in progress. I'm not going to necessarily give you the answer today because I still have those 2 sections left to write. And the research goes into case law. The research goes into the origins of language. When I was working on my PhD here and took oral comprehensive examinations, one of the questions that Peggy Blanchard asked me was, how do you know when to stop conducting research when you're working on a project? And I couldn't answer it then, and I can't answer it now. So this thing just continues to grow. And interestingly enough, maybe the first week I was here, I went with Kathy and Woody over to the law school for a program on library privacy, which didn't really strike me at the time as being an issue. But now I'm kind of glad that my friends and neighbors can't go into the Davis Library and find the titles of the books that I've been checking out that are related to this topic. At any rate, one of the things I learned as I was doing some of that background research, that is no surprise, one of the things I learned was that many of us use expletives, offensive language, because it's an easy way to be scandalous without having to face severe consequences. This is an area that's forbidden, and we can enter into it without it bothering us very much. Saying dirty words is, you know, we curse because we can, basically. And I have an anecdote to tell that highlights that. When I was working on my master's degree way back before the war in the old country, one of the things that Richard Cole taught me when I was writing feature stories and news stories was get anecdotes into the story. This involves my grandson, who is 6. My family has a Christmas tradition, and that is that we always go out for lunch together on Christmas Eve. And this started when my middle son was very young, and we always went to one of Blacksburg's best pizza restaurants because he loved pizza. And we continue to do that. So 2 years ago, well, every Christmas Eve, my grandson is with us, his dad and our family. So 2 years ago, we were going out to lunch. And on the way home from lunch, my wife had remembered something she needed to pick up for a Christmas present. So we dropped her off at this craft store and went up and turned around and we're waiting there. So in the car were myself, my 3 sons, and my 4-year-old grandson. And we were waiting for my wife. And so my grandson looks down and says, "Hey, there are no girls here." I said, "Right, there are no girls in the car." He said, "Now we can talk about farting." His father, obviously, having taught him that there's certain words you don't say around your mother or around your grandmothers or any other girls. And so, the story being that sometimes we can enter into scandal just because we can. Of course, there is a hierarchy of foul language. Some words are just worse than others. The word we're going to be talking about, or I'm going to be dealing with here, as Ralphie taught us in the Christmas story, is the Queen Mother. Anybody seen this movie? Okay, nobody seemed to recognize it when it came up on the screen. I was wondering who had seen the movie. This FCC versus Fox television stations is a wonderful case to look at, not only because it allows us to enter into scandal, but because it tells us a lot about this particular case. The case was handed down in April 2009, but as you might guess, it had a long pedigree. The pedigree actually begins in 1971, when Robert Paul Cohen entered the Los Angeles County Courthouse wearing a jacket with this slogan inscribed upon it. This wasn't his jacket. As a matter of fact, the words on his jacket were considerably smaller, and there were other slogans there as well. Stop war. There were peace symbols, so it wasn't nearly as dramatic as this appeared. He wore the jacket into the corridor, and then he went into a courtroom. He was a witness, going to be a witness in a case, and he took off his jacket and draped it over his arms. He was followed into the courtroom by a police officer, a bailiff, a deputy sheriff, who was there keeping peace in the courthouse. And the deputy sheriff went to the judge and asked the judge to find Cohen in contempt of court. The judge refused to do so. So when Cohen later left the courtroom and went back into the corridor, he was arrested. And the case made its way to the Supreme Court. Cohen is an important case for a number of reasons that I'm not going to go into. It's important to the case I'm talking about. It's important to this issue today, however, because of the way Justice John Marshall Harlan dealt with the issue. I tell my students that every once in a while in a Supreme Court case you can find what I call a nugget of common sense that just transcends the law. It just makes such good sense that why didn't you see it? That's what Justice Harlan did in Cohen. Language, he says, has at least 2 elements. There's the cognitive element, and the cognitive element is the definition, the dictionary definition of the word. There's also the emotive element. And the emotive element, he said, deserves as much First Amendment protection as the cognitive, because practically speaking, that may often be the more important element of the overall message sought to be communicated. And what Justice Harlan wrote, what the holding was in this case, helped strike down the proposition that the government can say to us, there is certain language that you can never use in public because of the value or lack of value of that language. Now, the court has said that in fighting words cases and other cases. But basically, this helped strike down that notion, and it had to do with the value of the language. And Justice Harlan refused to discuss the value of the language. What he discussed was what it may mean in public discourse. Well, that same issue came up 7 years later in the Pacifica case, which is another case that we all know about. Very briefly, a father and son, father was driving his son in New York City one afternoon and turned on WBAI radio, which was owned by the Pacific Foundation, and heard a monologue that was being delivered by the philosopher George Carlin. And it had to do with an afternoon program on the use of language in society. And the monologue was called Filthy Words, and Carlin repeated a number of words, 7 of them, that he said you can never, ever say over the airwaves. The father complained, and Pacifica was reprimanded. And again, well, there's some similarities between the facts of Pacifica and the facts of Cohen. Though Pacifica dealt with broadcasting, which is a different animal when it comes to First Amendment protection. And Pacifica was an important case, but I'm only going to deal with what the court said about the use of the language. Justice Stevens, John Paul Stevens, for the majority, most of what he wrote was for the majority. But then he got into a portion of the opinion in which he was discussing the value of language or the lack of value of language. And he lost 2 votes in that part of the opinion. So his opinion became a plurality opinion rather than a majority opinion. But what he said was that, he admitted in some circumstances the words that are at issue here might be protected, but they're not protected here. And even when they are protected, they surely lie at the periphery of First Amendment concern. There are few, if any, thoughts that cannot be expressed by the use of less offensive language. Use better words. The issue here was the use of words. That's what the whole issue was about. Justice Brennan took him to task on a number of points, including his approach toward expression. Sounding a little bit like Justice Harlan, Brennan wrote that it's transparently fallacious to think that you can separate a message and its potential impact from the words that are the vehicle of the expression. The words are important. Quoting Oliver Wendell Holmes, Justice Brennan wrote that words are the skin of living thoughts and may vary greatly in color, content according to the circumstances of time. And so there was this dispute about the value of words, and Pacifica had to do with the value of words. It's important to point out here that though there was this focus on the language, the court in Pacifica ruled that the broadcast, the Carlin monologue, was indecent as broadcast. That means using the repetitive language, the language being repeated, and in the middle of the afternoon, as opposed to some other time of day in which it might have been protected. Okay, Stevens made that point clearly in the majority opinion, and it was reiterated in a concurring opinion. Now, that language, the language about time of day and repetition, will come back. We'll see it again when we get to Fox television stations. There's one more bit of background that I need to talk about before we get into the direct events of Fox television stations, and that has to do with Janet Jackson's breast. You will remember, well, I don't remember very well, I'm told, that in the 2004 Super Bowl, Justin Timberlake, during the halftime show, grabbed a portion of Janet Jackson's costume, and for 9/16 of 1 second, her breast was exposed. The FCC cannot sanction a network because networks do not broadcast. What the FCC can do, however, is sanction broadcast stations. This event, as silly as it was, caused a lot of activity. One of the things it caused was for Congress to approve an increase in the amount that could be fined, that a broadcast station could be fined for a single incident of indecency. That fine was increased from $32,500 to $325,000. In addition, CBS Corporation was fined $550,000 for the broadcast of this over stations that were owned by CBS. CBS appealed, and the Third U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals struck down the fine because it said the fine was capricious and arbitrary. It was unfair because the indecency was the result of a vendor, in effect, and CBS had no way of knowing what was going to be shown and no way to control it. And finally, it was struck down because it violated the FCC's own fleeting expletives policy. Fleeting expletives. This is where things get interesting. Jump back to Pacifica. Carlin's monologue was protracted. The words were repeated over and over again. The court was clear that that repetition had a part to do with the reprimand. And the court specifically said, we're not deciding whether a single fleeting expletive can be sanctioned as being indecent. So, thus, the court in Pacifica approved of the FCC's fleeting expletives policy. And then following Pacifica, the FCC embraced that policy and put it into play a number of times. So the Third Circuit was correct in its ruling that the FCC had violated its own policy. But the FCC wasn't through rocking the boat. A year before Janet Jackson and Justin Timberlake had their fling, the entertainer Bono won a Golden Globes award. And when he received the award, he said, this is, you see what he said, really, really fucking brilliant. The FCC Enforcement Bureau, when it received complaints, concluded that this was not indecent because it did not describe sexual activities and it was fleeting and isolated. The full FCC reversed that holding, finding that it did have a sexual connotation because it always has a sexual connotation. In fact, it is one of the most vulgar, graphic, and explicit descriptions of sexual activity in the English language. But the case ended there because the FCC also said that the broadcaster didn't have sufficient warning about the change in policy, therefore it was not fair for the broadcaster to be sanctioned or reprimanded. So the case ended. No reprimands. After that, the FCC compiled some of the complaints it had received over the years, going back as far as 2002. And in 2006, it issued a statement indicating that many of these broadcasts were indecent. Again, it issued no reprimands because these broadcasters didn't have sufficient warning. But Fox television stations wasn't satisfied and pushed the issue. The FCC did not object, and so the case went to the, what did I mention before, the third, is this the third or the second circuit? Third Circuit, I think. And the FCC broadcast involved two awards programs, the 2002 and the 2003 Billboard Music Awards. In 2002, Cher won an award, and she complained about her critics, saying, for 40 years they have been telling me that I'm through so far. And then in 2003, Nicole Richie used both the S word and the F word, and after being told in a mocking tone by her co-presenter, Paris Hilton, that she should be careful. She's on the air. seem to matter. So the question when the FCC complained, when Fox television station took this to court, the question, believe it or not, had nothing to do with whether these broadcasts were indecent. Remember I said this was an administrative law case. The question was whether the FCC had changed, the change in the FCC policy was proper under the, Administrative Procedures Act. The Administrative Procedures Act requires a federal administrative agency, when it changes its policy, to explain why. And Fox television station says the FCC didn't do this. And that's what it was asking the court to decide. Justice Scalia had no trouble finding that the FCC had met the requirements. It's wrong, he said, to think that the FCC has to go through some protracted description. It's only necessary for the FCC to explain why this policy is a good policy, the new policy. It's not necessary to explain why the new policy is better than the old policy. And this policy is clearly better, even though the FCC didn't have to require it, because this policy makes good sense for two reasons. There is no rationale, no logical rationale, he wrote, between distinguishing between literal uses of the language and non-literal uses of the language. Second, it makes no sense to punish multiple uses of a word and not punish single uses of a word. When you have the same, what you do with that policy is you require listeners to take the first blow. That is, then when it continues. So that was the finding. Despite this rather mundane issue, however, it's clear that the F word was a key to Justice Scalia's decision. Twice in the opinion, Justice Scalia quoted language to the effect that the F word inherently has a sexual connotation, even when it's used in non-literal context. It's always sexual, he wrote. Twice he quoted that language I just read a moment ago, in which the F word was called the most vulgar, graphic, and explicit description of sexual activity in the English language. And he wrote, the word's power to insult and offend derives from only one place. That is its sexual meaning. So that's one side of it. It's always about sex, and that's where the power comes from. Justice Stevens, you remember, was the author of Pacifica. And Justice Stevens wasn't so sure. First, he complained that the court in Fox had used Pacifica as a precedent. It isn't a precedent. He said, in Pacifica, we certainly did not hold that any word with a sexual or scatological origin, however used, was indecent. That's what the court said Pacifica was about, but it wasn't. Second, and this goes back to the oral arguments in which he and Scalia clashed when the case was argued before the court. Second, he said, it's not always about sex. And he used this description of a golfer. Certainly, he said, it's absurd to think that golfer who says the word after hitting the ball into the pond or into the woods is using a sexual term.
That was before Tiger Woods.
Pardon?
That was before Tiger Woods.
He said that was absurd, but certainly, but this is the absurdity that the FCC has embraced. Now, the difference between Justice Stevens and Justice Scalia, of course, is that Justice Scalia convinced 4 of the people to vote with him. And so you had the 5-4 majority. So that settled the issue. The issue was about the Administrative Procedures Act. Did the court, did the FCC satisfy the act? Yes. The discussion about the F word, while it was interesting, was not germane to the topic. But that didn't settle all the questions. As you know, those of you who read what the court does occasionally, the court only answers the questions that it's asked. It doesn't volunteer anything. And so the Second Circuit, the court whose opinion Justice Scalia so enthusiastically overturned, did not deal with the constitutional issue. That is, the issue of whether the government, even for the purposes of broadcasting, can rule that there are certain words that can never be said. And the court didn't answer that issue. But Justice Scalia hinted that the issue isn't dead. It might be true, he said, that this ruling will cause certain broadcasters not to use words that they could legally use because their speech has been chilled. If that issue comes up, that is, if the constitutional issue comes up, we'll deal with it then. And he said that is probably going to happen pretty soon. Perhaps in this very case. So, the case was sent back to the Third Circuit. 6 days after the court sent Fox television stations back to the Third Circuit, it vacated the judgment in the CBS case, the Janet Jackson case. It vacated that judgment, sent it back to the Second Circuit, saying to the Second Circuit, decide this case based on our holding in FCC versus Fox television stations. That case is still sitting there. But Fox television stations isn't sitting. On January the 13th, we're talking a month and 5 days ago, the Second Circuit heard oral arguments on the constitutional issue in FCC versus Fox television stations. And the judges made it very clear that they think the FCC approach is silly. So there's a possibility that before too long, 2 cases might be coming back to the court on those kinds of issues. And the question becomes, is anything going to be different second time around? Well, you never know that. Justice Sonia Sotomayor has replaced David Souter on the court. David Souter voted with the dissenters. We can assume, though it might not be a safe assumption, that Justice Sotomayor, we will presume without deciding, which is something the court sometimes does. We will presume without deciding that Justice Sotomayor is going to vote with Justice Stevens. There's evidence that she might, just as there's evidence that she won't might, that she might not. So if that happens, then the key to the case might end up in the hands of guess who? Anybody have a guess? That's better than the F word. That's better than the F word. In his concurring opinion to Fox television stations, Justice Clarence Thomas did not mention anything that was in the majority opinion, except that he agreed. Justice Thomas went off on one of his tangents, not really a tangent. Justice Thomas attacked Redline Broadcasting and FCC versus Pacifica. Redline Broadcasting was not mentioned in the majority opinion. It was not cited in the majority opinion. But Redline Broadcasting is the case in which the court upheld specifically the personal attack rule and generally the fairness doctrine, both of which have subsequently been discontinued by the FCC. It was based on the fact that broadcasting is different, that broadcasting is uniquely pervasive, that the electromagnetic spectrum is scarce, and so therefore the government can regulate broadcasting. Now those same rationales were the basis for FCC versus Pacifica. In Fox television stations, Justice Thomas said that the 2 opinions, I don't think that's the quote I want to give you. Yeah, the 2 opinions were unconvincing convincing when they were issued, and the passage of time has only increased doubt regarding their continued validity. There is no basis in the Constitution to treat broadcasting differently, he wrote, and there's less reason now because dramatic changes in technology have eliminated spectrum scarcity. And if not spectrum scarcity, at least the need for spectrum scarcity. And those and other changes have rendered the broadcast media no longer uniquely pervasive. With regard to broadcast indecency, therefore, Justice Thomas is looking a lot like Justice William Douglas looked on the issue of obscenity. Justice Douglas, when the Supreme Court was set up the movie theater to watch the dirty movies to decide whether they were obscene, never went to the movies because he said it's irrelevant what's on the screen. The Constitution doesn't say no law, comma, unless it's obscene. Justice Thomas says it really doesn't matter if the government says these words are indecent. The government shouldn't have the authority because there's no rationale. So what does that mean? It might mean nothing. But it might mean that if Justice Thomas can join Justice Scalia in finding that the Administrative Procedures Act has been met, he might also be able to join Justice Stevens in an opinion saying that the FCC doesn't have the authority to ban all uses of any word because broadcasting is uniquely pervasive, because broadcasting is different. Now, if that happens, does that make the definition of the F word irrelevant? It might. Recognize that when we're talking about broadcast indecency, we're not talking about generic indecency. Lots of things might be indecent to us, but when it comes to broadcasting, words aren't indecent unless they're related to sex or bodily functions. If they fall outside of those two, they're not indecent. So the definition then of the F word becomes important. Who's right? Scalia or Stevens, and does it depend on context? On the other hand, there might be clearly relevant. I mean, it might go either way. You don't know which way it's going to go because, we don't know whether Sotomayor, how she's going to come down on this. She might come down one way or the other, so the definition then might be important. So, back to the first question. This is a book I checked out at the library, by the way, believe it or not. It's a bad book. You don't want to check it out. It grew out of a law journal article, and I'm convinced that the reason this guy wrote the law journal article is it goes back to the same reason my grandson wanted to say the word fart. He just liked to say the word. He liked to write the word. But at any rate, what do people who know more about language say about this particular word? There are multiple definitions. Even the Oxford English Dictionary has multiple definitions, many of which don't mention sex. In addition, when you use the word as an expletive, you don't care what the meaning is. Many of the authorities say, you're just going to use an offending word. You're just going to pick a word, depending on how angry you are. You go up the scale, depending upon how. But, on the other hand, the word has no other primary meaning. All other meanings are figurative or consciously derivative. When a man says, I got my day all fucked up, he is fully aware of the primary sexual meaning of the word. This was written in 1934. And I don't think it has changed. And so, we're kind of back to where we were at the beginning. Both Scalia and Stevens are right. And that's what's going to make this an interesting problem to deal with. So, what do you do? One thing you can do is go back to Colloquium and Justice Harlan and not worry about the definitions of words, but worry about the use of the word. And Justice Harlan argued that words have meaning that transcend the cognitive meaning, the definition. And so if a word is used in an emotive, pardon me, you need to recognize the emotive value of a word. And so, Cohen's speech, even though it wasn't said in the heat of an argument, Justice Harlan clearly classed as emotive. Other kinds of speech that might be emotive might be flag burning, cross burning, fighting words might be emotive and therefore deserve some kinds of protection. Carlin's monologue was well thought out. The first time I heard that monologue, I wasn't as accustomed to so many words in one time. And I just rolled on the floor laughing. It was the kind of thing you would laugh at and then feel guilty because you were laughing at it. It was well thought out. It was protracted. It was a composition. And it presented an argument. It deserved protection. And the court agreed that it deserved protection. Except for the time of day. And so, this last little bit is what I'm still exploring. Is there a model here that would give courts some guidance in dealing with this issue? And if there is a model, would it be the kind of thing that the sitting court would consider to get away from the kinds of things that they're doing now? So there are a lot of unanswered questions, which is good, because those of us who do research like to have unanswered questions. It gives us something to do in our spare time. This is not to say that, the word is still clearly taboo. It's not to be used in polite company, and there are always consequences, for using the word.
Questions?
Yeah. Questions?
No, I want to ask a question. And I really appeal to all my law colleagues here for this question. That phrase that you used, you said who is right or who is right. And in every single case that your excellent presentation of this particular case, one judge goes off on this one goes off on that one. Does that question make sense? I mean, it always turns out to be just like 5 to 3 or 2 to 1 or 6 to 1. I mean, what the question implies that there's some kind of legal position, but there are many legal positions. And what's right is what wins, isn't it? I mean, am I asking that question right?
Yeah.
Obviously not. Or am I? Does it make sense?
You're right.
Yes. You're right. And you've got authorities from Holmes to Brennan who say the same thing. Brennan was a pretty gloomy guy, and he basically said, the law is what the majority says it is.
What was the vote on Roe v. Wade? What was the 3 to 6?
That's what I thought,
Wasn't it?
And I guess if you have 8 to 1, it's certainly different, or 9 to 1, like in the Brown decision, is certainly a different statement from 5 to 6. And
That's why who's appointed the court is so important.
yeah,
Because anybody who tries to say ideology doesn't matter
yeah.
isn't looking,
Uh,
isn't looking,
I had a question. Do you think there may be a model? Do you think that the court is making an assumption? They're looking at this dictionary definition and searching if it deals with sex or an expiratory function, then it's obscene or it can be regulated. But doesn't that make an assumption that what is offensive to the reasonable person is sex or excretory functions. And so couldn't the question, do you think that there's any promise in just going on a reasonable person standard? I mean, we ask all the time in the law, is something highly offensive to a reasonable person, rather than, does it mean, instead of chopping up, the linguistic meaning of this word and looking for multiple definitions, isn't the harm that we're looking to prevent in the first place offending reasonable persons? I mean, is there any promise in that standard?
Reasonable children.
Or reasonable children, reasonable families? I mean,
It's really hard. Yeah.
aren't we, is it possible that the court's asking the wrong question here and trying to split a hair, sometimes it
Well,
means it's
y-
that.
Yeah, and this is not the first time that's come up, and it won't be the last. But Justice Brennan, in his Pacifica dissent, said a number of things. Two things that were key. One thing was, the court is once again saying that everybody should think the way the court does. And we live in a diverse society. This was even back in '78 when diversity wasn't a key word. We live in a diverse society and people don't think the way we do. And the other one was you're taking decisions out of the hands of parents. And maybe parents would like their kids to hear this in the right context. But there again, they're talking about this one thing. And the Second Circuit in oral arguments when the Solicitor General or whoever it was saying we're trying to protect children. One of the judges says, protect children from what? Like, they're going to hear it on TV, and that's the first time they're going to hear it. Now, I have not found, and I haven't looked for it, however, Woody, I have not found a rationale for that definition of indecency that the FCC has established. That it has to do with words that are related to sexual activities or excrement and other bodily functions. But that's what the FCC said. And the court in the FCC and Fox television stations, the court said the general definition of indecency is something that offends, it wasn't sex, offends common decency or offends those kinds of things. So there is a broader definition of indecency that might be a better definition, better use.
There was, during, when violence was a much